Right, so before we finish, I want to emphasize a couple of things about the activity of the frontal lobes and bring back the idea of the study of a single case like Phineas Gage, but link it now to a specific part of the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex, which of course is where Phineas suffered the most loss of tissue. And just make a couple of points about the limitations of lesion studies. So even Phineas is weak evidence, because Phineas, like Broca's case Tan, didn't just have very discrete damage to one part of the brain. A lot of the frontal lobe was damaged. The majority of the damage was in the prefrontal area. So we know that loss of tissue in the prefrontal cortex is correlated with the kind of behavior that Phineas showed to be become abnormal. Now, there are other ways of studying the functions of the frontal lobes, and we can notice in the study of psychiatry that if we go to personality, there are certain features of acquired frontal lobe damage, such as Phineas showed, that arise in psychiatric conditions such as manic depression. So manic depression is a type of disorder where a person experiences both very high moods, very elated moods, and very low moods. And we believe that these mood swings are due to imbalance in serotonin and some other neurotransmitters. So these mood swings that we see are very much driven by chemical processes in the brain. That's something we know because administering additional serotonin through medication like serotonin reuptake inhibitors will balance the swings of manic behavior and depression, so that person with manic depression becomes more balanced. But interestingly, in the case of mania and depression, we also see some correlates in the sort of behavior that Phineas Gage produced when he had suffered his prefrontal cortex damage. And that includes things that found in the same person, but highly contradictory. So a person with manic depression can show both apathy, one period, which of course is something that we know happens with prefrontal damage, but correlate at a different point can show a great deal of emotional ebullience, explosive emotional elation. So we've got these two contradictory processes that happen in the same individual due to manic depression, but also we observe this in someone with damage to the prefrontal cortex. We've got, in addition, an interesting difference between distractibility, on the one hand, in a person with mania in the manic phase, which is a little bit like ADHD. So people cannot focus their attention well. Whereas in the depressive phase, we've got essentially a form of akinesia, which is not responsive at all, just no movement whatsoever. In the most extreme form, we can see a condition called catatonia, which means a person is lying in a fixed shape in bed all day. It's called tonia because the actual body shape can be very contorted, like a tonic flexion of the muscles in the body. The body is so limited in its processing of dopamine that it literally becomes like a living statue, catatonia. And finally, we see something quite interesting in the manic profile, which is called confabulation, which refers to making up events that never happened. So we see lots of memory errors, shall we say, in the manic phase, which is little white lies. Not deliberate, actually, just the patient, in fact, can believe that they're experiencing those memories that they recollect, but they're not veridical, they're false. They're so-called false memories. And in the confabulatory phase of the manic period, we can observe people who are absolutely certain that their memory of an event, an episode, is correct, despite patent evidence to the contrary that they couldn't possibly have experienced that episode. In the case of depression, however, we don't see confabulation. We see a tendency to simply say no, to simply not respond, to be mute, to not give any verbal account of their recollections. What's curious about confabulation is that these false memories that we see in confabulation are things that we all experience a lot of the time. So sometimes we can be absolutely certain we've seen something happen or heard something or experienced something that actually we never did experience. They're illusory, they're illusions. And our mental system is trained to experience illusions, because the one thing we can say about the human mind, and probably the brain, is that we are blessed with a sense of agency, as Daniel Dennett would say. That is, we are actively seeking information to process. And the motivation for that probably is the selfish gene. But nevertheless, we are engaged in a constant effort to adapt to our environment. And for that reason, our cognitive system is built to perceive the world in ways that are most adaptive. But unfortunately, that fools us a lot of the time, so that we believe things that are not actually true. And it's only because those belief systems have developed to protect the species, to protect the group, to protect the self, that we fall into such illusory habits. So we believe things that we can't see, we get fooled by things that haven't occurred, and basically we're pretty gullible humans, unfortunately. But we're not the only ones. I don't know, if you have a dog, then you'll know that they're pretty gullible too. Cats, not so much.